That's, that's the price of a pig. It just doesn't make sense. Why would you buy, how could you buy an island with all these people living on it for the price of a pig? So it's been about a 10 to 1 inflation rate since 1640s. So I've done a lot of studies on this, and anything you can buy for 1 guilder, which was sort of like $1 in those days, roughly, then you would pay $10 today, and it almost always works out. But you got to remember that you would have to consider comparing a handmade or home-crafted item with the same today. So not some cheap, mass-marketed thing, but if you take like a kettle that's really a fine copper kettle, one that's really made out of the real material, and then you think, well, that's what a copper kettle was then, so it might be 4 guilders and then $40 today, whatever. It depends on, like, the quality would match. But this whole idea about, everybody was stealing the land and whatnot, it's just usually not exactly true. But one of the things that there were circumstances surrounding these sales which were very coercive, but it's very hard to quantify that. So some of this was going for cheap, some of the land was going for cheap, but also one of the things is that the Dutch were paying with trinkets. And it takes an awful lot of trinkets to buy land, if you think about it. So, at a certain point it becomes impractical. Like how high a pile of trinkets do you want to procure and then carry and then sell? Well, they I think, didn't do so bad. But it's more like what, if they would have spent for, 50 acres, then you might buy 1 acre today in the country, but remember this inflation. So I just want to talk about Queesgeeks. And again, in my map, the Tintagis were there. Their seat was at Dobbs Ferry, but they had a very wide reach. And the county of Westchester may have been named indirectly after them, as their boundaries are similar. Remember I mentioned Sissycamus, and he might have administered the Tintagis. Their main fort was on Palisade Street in Dobbs Ferry on the Hudson River shoreline, but they also had a center at Greenwich and Stanford, apparently. And again, Queesgeek is like the head of a shallow inlet. I've seen other things. Tintagis, I just want to share with you that that pronunciation is very important, because people look at it, it says Tan-Kittikis, right? And but the last of the Tintagis that we know about is the Sachem who passed away, and before he died he told me that it's Tintagis, and tell everybody that he wanted it pronounced right. So I go everywhere and I always mention that it's Tintagis. So that's eastern Westchester. And forest dwellers, Mohican, or maybe little lodges, small lodges, according to one's native source. Some were from the Horse Neck of Connecticut, and a lot of them moved to Paterson, New York, along Route 22, which was the Codman Path. So that brings them up the Toquams, and Toquams are very interesting. Shenorock was a chief of the Siwanoy in a big way, very famous chief, and he was succeeded by Pathonk. I won't go into all of that, but Siwanoy, Southwest Connecticut, for seawan or clams or oyster shells, and the people of wampum makers, in other words. So Toquams means round rock in Pawgusset. And Pawgusset you don't usually see openly associated with Wappingers, but in fact the Pawgusset were probably one of the main Connecticut tribes who came over and became part of what became the Wappingers. There's very few Wappinger locations that reveal references to the Pawgusset. So we had various chiefs that I want to mention, and they moved to the Great Swamp at Paterson, New York, where some say, perhaps there are still some today, became their main homeland via this Tulpehoken Trail or the Route 22 to a place called Aiken's Corners, where there was an Aiken's tribe, which became their council fireplace, and 4 other villages shared with the Tintagis. So the Kichwa, remember, so they're the Harahamis in this area, Kichwa means great tributary, and the K is a plural referring to the people. And so they're very famous, actually. Chief Croatan, he sold much of Lewisboro. Now, Croatan is an interesting name. Again, Connotan, winded his hair, probably from Gross Connotan, which may be a big knot in his hair, we don't know. But, or Cloten, he contends. And of course, again, the Dutch used the city on the east coast of Italy to remember. Now, Croton, the chief, sold the hop grounds, which is very famous, in Bedford. And then he sold Armonk and a number of sales. So we know a lot about where he was, but the Harahamas are mysterious. In Saugatuck, Kanjatoa subtribe, and also called Sequins, I believe. And the Scatticook were a UN of tribes that emerged out of the Mohicans and expanded southward, absorbing refugees from various battles. And then they became administrators of that sachem from Connecticut. Now, one of the things that I want to mention, that the Wappingers were very progressive, and they were a lot more like, in some ways, like Americans, perhaps today, in maybe the positive sense, and that they were progressive. They're always thinking of new things, and they would bring in refugees, sort of like the Statue of Liberty. You know, anybody who was in trouble, they'd, you know, come on in and join us. You know, so they're pretty open about that, and constantly changing too because of that. So let's talk about that migration. So this is a map. This is all of Westchester, and it's a little much, I guess, but you know, the arrows. I want to point out that this line here, going along, I guess a lot of it's along 22, or the common path, and that's the ridge between the watersheds. But this is the dividing line between East Westchester and West Westchester, and the people in the west apparently were part of this Tappan Confederacy, which went up and down the Hudson, and the Tappan people basically administered all the ferries, and they were dugout canoes, muhuls as they were called, and they were you know, made out of tulip trees. And this tribe basically, or this commonwealth, administered them, made sure that they were safe, because really their economy was very reliant on these ferry boats. So when these people, native people, were being pushed out of their land by Connecticut, English, and the Dutch coming up from Manhattan, their behavior was different according to which they were part of, because it was a little harder to, if you're in the eastern sector, to apparently use those ferry boats. Maybe you're not as familiar with them, or we don't know, but most of the ferry boat use was more on the western side. On the eastern side, they mostly moved north, which would suggest they're moving away from the New Amsterdam expansion. So it was a lot of turmoil in the 1600s. There were military attacks, there were massacres. Now, I want to point the Sacos. Sacos way up in the upper left. There was a tribe that were living on the shoreline, but then all of these troubles began, and they moved up the Peekskill Hollow along the creek and hid in the mountains, where some of their descendants still live today. And here's the Kitchewan River, and at the end of the Kitchewan River, of course, is Croton Point. This was another ferry spot, so people were moving west from here. And then another one, well, you know, Tarrytown is not clear. They were called Pokerho. And here is one of the most interesting ones from this area, where these people decided to leave. They called themselves Wequesquis, and they went to New Jersey. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. The Coropus were in White Plains, and right here, and they all made an agreement to go to Wisquaqua, or Dobbs Ferry, to join the Wequesquik there. And the Wequesquik, south of Yonkers, moved to Newark, New Jersey, to the Wequahic Park, which is almost the same word. It became part of the Raritan people. So the Mihag is the Indian Point, as you remember. There's a power plant there now. And it was called Indian Point because in 1900, the Mohawks would come down in canoes and they just land on the shore, and they would just, you know, unload all their stuff for the powwow, and it was really easy to carry everything around, right? And then at the end of the powwow, they just dump it back in the canoe and go north. And so, and of course the Algonquins were running the powwow. So it was a big area where Mohegans and other Iroquois people were getting along and cooperating with the local Algonquins. So Mi'kmaq means oysters, and very distinctly. So there's these two Westchesters. You see, you have the east and the west. So I'm going to break this down a little bit more. So this is north, and the triangles, as you see, are villages. The triangles inside yellow circles. And the red lines represent these migration routes. So this is just the north, and you see that's mostly it's divided east to west. And let's see, I've mentioned a lot of this. Okay. The Katona Massacre was led by Underhill, was February 24th, 1644, and that was over here in the Kitchewan area. And so this, it says in March, but that's wrong. Political pressure from Connecticut and again from New Amsterdam. So it was a lot of turmoil. Then between 1660 and 1710, the Romantinet came from somewhere in Westchester. And nobody seems to know exactly where, but they're a very interesting group. And they settled in Haverstraw, which is, you know, they settled in the area there, and then the Dutch or whoever, you know, came and wanted to know, wanted to grow plants there. And then, according to the story, the natives said, so would you like to know what Romantinet means? And the colonists said, no, we don't have time for that. We really need our plants. We need to grow things quickly. And so they sold them the land, and then the next year they came back and they complained because they couldn't grow anything. The soil was like hard clay, and so they said, would you like to know what the word Romantinet means? And they said, yes, I guess we'd like to know. I said, well, it means a really bad place to grow corn. So the Dutch were I believe this was Dutch, they were very clever and resourceful, and they consulted with their Bibles, by the way, and talked about, you know, the Israelites using oat straw to make their bricks stronger. And so they made bricks right out of the soil that they were going to garden in, so it gives you an idea how bad it was for gardening. And they added the oat straw, and it worked and became now the National Museum of Brickmaking. However, what's really interesting is that Haverstraw, of course, Haverstraw, however you want to pronounce it, is oat straw. And then it's still called that. So here's the lower part of Westchester. And again, you see this interesting big red arrow going from the Wecqueesgeeks of this sawmill or Nebraham, but also this Bronx River, which at that point someone called Sewer Route. And see the tap-in line goes right down the middle, watershed. And so the corpus of White Plains moved to Dobbs Ferry, famously, and that had to do with opening up portage routes. And the Nyack Nation moved from Brooklyn, and they were being troubled. They were very unlucky in war, and the Nyack Nation was affiliated with these Tappan, and so they negotiated and they moved to the Tappan Hills, and that is now called Nyack, New York. So that's another set of maps I don't have. But what's interesting too is this migration from near Yonkers to this place in New Jersey, which I think maybe some of you know. Elizabeth Channel was the cove leading to Wequahic Creek. You see, this is Elizabeth. It's partly artificially dug like a canal, and then this part is the Wequahic Creek, and it winds around and goes to this this lake, and it's the same name. And then you see the roads, prominent roads connecting that. And here's Elizabeth River down here, and these are the trails. Again, 22 keeps showing up. So here's the Wequahic Lake, and this whole area is the Wequahic territory. So 4 different sources, including a Raritan chief, confirm this subtribe is from Wickers Creek area of Yonkers, and the creek defines the boundary between the Hackensack to the north and the Raritans to the south. So I think that shows you what a major role that migrations played from Westchester, mostly out, but some not. So here's another little known trail called the Great South Minisink Path. Once they were in Newark, where would they go? Well, they could have been welcomed into the Tappan Commonwealth for sure, and become part of the Minisink-Muncie Confederacy, which was very, very large, and Tappans were part of that. So there's confederacies within commonwealths, and so forth and so on. There's wheels, we say hoops within hoops. And this is the Great South Minisink Trail through New Jersey that leads to Minisink Island, which is the capital of all these peoples, the Muncie and all their affiliates. But now it's a little hard to reconstruct. It's various roads that follow this original trail with different names. It goes through the Passaic territory. And this is Dobbs Ferry. Remember I said that there was a crossing to Sneeden's Landing, and that was a Mulhall Ferry. And then here's the Wisquaqua village here, and there's Dobbs Ferry here. And there was a little waterfall at the head of the cove. You see how the Mohican Trail is now Broadway, you see, and see how it comes to this sharp turn, which is obviously you would say would be a prominent feature, but really what it's doing is kind of wrapping around this big waterfall here. And then the waterfall flows down in Wickers Creek. So what happens today is, you know, if you get there, sometimes you're driving and you might get stuck in traffic here for a long time. That's how you know it's important archaeologically, is the traffic stop. But you turn there. But another thing that happens here is the road is often being repaired because it's built like over nothing. I mean, it's built over a hollow, over a waterfall that's very active. So that's the head of the cove, and that's a very prominent place. And so there's various other different streams, like the North Branch goes through Mercy College, and people have dug there. So there's cornfields. Wisquaqua, one translation, there's cornfields to the west because one of the words for corn is the yellow mother, because it's part of that whole, if you want to call it, mythology. So that's just a composite map of, and just showing you where, here we are, okay? There's SUNY Purchase, and we've discussed all these rivers being nearby and where they go. So here's Portages. This one's from Chicago, but this is a portage area. It's a very big part of American history that most people don't ever discuss. So the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, had a chain of portages along the Mohawk River. Now this is the most important. The Oriskany battlefield was at a portage. Here's the Mohawk River, which you could canoe on, but then when you get to Fort Stanwix, there's a 4-mile strip of land that there's no way to get across other than carry your boat. And so you carry your boat 4 miles, nobody ever complained, and you get into the Oneida system and then the Oswego River, and then you're in the Great Lakes. And then from there, you go anywhere you want. You could go all the way to Lake Superior with some minor portage, where you have great stores of copper lying around, and some of our wonderful Algonquin people. And then from there, there's lots of ways you could go. You get into the Mississippi River, and then from there you take a jackknife up the Missouri River, then you're in the Rockies, and then from there, the Milk. And it's amazing that 4 miles that you carry your boat is called the Keys to the Continent. But some people have called all portages the Keys to the Continent, but in the last 100 years, it's almost been forgotten. But here's, some places are very rich in portage potential, and one of them is Mount Kisco, or Bedford. And so I try to, hopefully you can kind of get this, but this is the deeper stuff. These little red lines are portages, and it's beautiful when they're short, and because if you ever carried a 40-pound boat or an 80-pound boat, it gets heavier. And so here you have a very short portage between these two river systems. Here is an important, maybe not so short, but a very important one. Here's another short one, not too long. So these are the portages in red. And what happens is that the Mohawks could come down from the Mohawk River, come down the Hudson, looking for the wampum from the Snackapin's factory, and then come down to this river, and then come down here where they have to portage. And once they portage, they get all the way to the East River where that Snackapin's factory is. And there's other ways they can go too, go to other wampum factories. So here is like the Mianus River, they go through this portage, and then they can go this way, or they can go this way, or they can go this way, and they can go through these small portages. Mount Kisco is really the hub, because if you can get through these two or so portages, you really don't go anywhere. And again, they all, not only in terms of scope, but there's stuff to buy, you know, when you get there. The trade, really, to trade for all this wampum. And the Mohawks use that as a basis for their political system. Now, I've got to point out these these dotted green lines are very important. These are watershed lines. This is the Siskwa side. There's a four-way watershed, it's very unusual. This side is the Siskwa watershed for the Siskwa Creek. This is the Katona side for the Katona Creek. This is the Kitchewan watershed. This is the Mianus watershed, and this is the Bronx watershed. What's amazing is that once you get into one of these watersheds by crossing one of these ridges, you go a different place, you know, and that's amazing to me. They had all figured out. Okay, and so there's another, this is the actual Mohawk route. Here's the to the Snackapins. Here's the Croton River, they go here, they go down the Wampus River here, they go down the Bronx River here, and then they could go here, they could go down to the East River, the Snackapins. But this tiny little portage, they get to the Hutchinson, and that goes to the Lapa Walking Factory at Rye. And you've got all those more wampum to trade for. And then there's others too, you know, there's other important portages. So this is another view. This is the whole picture of that wampum route. So 7 rivers, the Hudson with Wickers Creek, Sawmill, Sprainbrook, Bronx, Sheldrake, Mamaroneck, all of these are intertwined around White Plains. So what do you think we should have questions, or are we not ready for that yet?
Yeah, if people have questions, then.
This is, oh yeah.
I don't know what a wampum is.
Wampum?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a conch shell.
Uh-huh.
Virginius. There's I think 2 species, and one is purple and one is white, and the purple are worth a lot. Well, the Dutch used muxes, and that's a tool, a metal tool that, you know, hollows them out. The natives had another way where they use a foot pedal using a foot drill, which is where you have a stick that holds the thing down, it's very small, and then you drill with your 2 hands. And so it was laborious. And so you could make a string of wampum, and then from many strings you could make a kind of a belt, like, you know, across, or you could make a whole kind of a stroke, like a big, huge sheet of them. They're very valuable. Okay. So
Thank you.
this is Coropus had this city, and they had this portage right through what is now White Plains. As you see, it goes right by some of the main buildings. And here is a map. This is downtown White Plains. You see the Bronx River over here, and here's Hamilton and Lake this way, which is a portage, and then Main Street is portage. So it's still there. And then here's signs actually showing you these portage routes, but of course under the guise of troop movements. So this is a map where you can see Mamaroneck over here, Bronx River over here, and how they're all connected with these red lines. And the yellow lines are the portage routes, and the reds are regular trails. This is, they look like Sprainbrook. This is that Ardsley, Sprain Brook, very easy to row. And here's the lower part. You see where we are is really just to the right over here, pretty close. So you see this Mamaroneck goes south to Long Island Sound. Here's the Sheldrake, which I haven't talked much about. It is important because it's in between, so you could use it as an in-between stopping place to row on or not, and that goes south. And this is in the sawmill in Yonkers, and it goes to an outlet to the Hudson, but there's this waterfall there, and what they did was, as I wrote somewhere that I said they should daylight that thing so we get a sense of the old ways, you know, where these rivers were, and lo and behold, they did. And I was a little surprised, since I didn't really think they'd do it. But now this is Neperhan, or, you know, the sawmill has been daylighted here, right in the middle of Yonkers. So this is a trail from Westquaqua, Dobbs Ferry, and this Portage, and that's Ardsley Road, and it connects several of these amazing rivers that are very good for rowing. And some of these sections are 5,000 feet here. It's not really too difficult. And there's Daniel Ninham. So any questions? Are we, yes, ma'am?
Earlier you mentioned adding subtitles to like the river signs, but are there any other ways you think we could like acknowledge, like purchase and acknowledge the land we're on?
Well, there's lots of ways. The question is what, you know, to think together. I mean, there's no limit. So one of the things people talk about is the land back movement, and I'm very skeptical about it. It's tricky. You may have heard about it, the idea of just giving land. It would have to be unused land, but to somebody Native American, and that's causing some problems, you know, because it's kind of wild and woolly, you can imagine. But other ways, you know, I think, well, it's best to consult with tribes. And the question about the Wappingers in particular, there really aren't any Wappingers organizations now. It's like 5 years ago, there were a number of Wappingers leaders, and almost all of them are gone. So, you know, I have been acting in that regard for 20 years as a spokesperson. But at this point, it's very difficult to find a Wappingers who is in a position of authority, you know. It's been a rough life. They're very humble people. And in the Wappingers language, the first person is subsumed. And if you're seeing a language like that, it's pretty crazy. And of course, some will talk like that in English because it's not based just on the language structure, but it's based on a moral principle that you shouldn't blab about yourself all the time. So when a Wappingers is speaking English, they may subsume the first person, which means that they just won't use the word me or I, and they will construct their sentences such a way that they don't have to, and it goes by, and you think, what did I just hear? So, you know, look carefully. So there are Wappingers people around, but again, what happens is they tend to, because of that, they tend to not step forward at all and just let it go, and, you know, they continue their culture in secret because they've had a pretty rough history. But in terms of this idea of stealing the land, that is, I think you should just be very careful and ask people, like, okay, so, you know, how do you know it was stolen? You know, because I have a number of deeds and treaties in my files, and occasionally I have, like, you know, a friend will say, oh, this land was stolen. I'll say, well, what about this treaty here? It says that they gave the, you know, a bunch of trinkets, and discuss whether that constitutes stealing or not. So in terms of that, that's, I think, the naming of, you know, double signage here is a tremendous start. Don't underestimate the importance of that. There's very little, if any, Wappingers music that you could say is specifically Wappingers. And literature, well, there's none, really, not much. Daniel Ninham here was the best known of all the Wappingers. He had a kind of a legal mind, and he studied law, and he studied English at Stockbridge, in Massachusetts at the school, and then he turned it on the British. But there's just, you know, it's a long discussion, but clearly starting having, you know, captioning or signage here, it would be a tremendous step forward. And one of the things too is that, you know, I have maps that I did of digital maps on a large scale of Wappingers territories, and there's one in Dutchess County which is now on display, and along with 20 other maps at the Dennings Point Center for Rivers and Estuaries, and it's going to be out for a little while. So that's something to go see. But you know, the maps really do contain a lot of the culture. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I can make it up. So besides the renaming, or I guess not renaming, but
Okay.
maybe side by side, and I know you said you don't like the, or not that you don't like, but it's bullied, the land back movement. So what other thoughts do you have, or plans to decolonize like the Westchester area that you suggest or leave behind?
Well, you know, there's also, of course, the streets. And let me show you, I'm going to jump through some things here. By the way, that's the structure of the 7 layers of government. They didn't just run around crazy in the woods with nowhere to go. They had a government. And so these are the actual names of the people in the Bronx Treaty for the Bronx. All of Algonquin, Eastern Algonquins. So these are the villages in Westchester, in Upper Westchester, and these are the villages in Lower Westchester. And these lines represent the roadways, and these in about 1700. And here is all the rivers in Westchester, and you see where the villages are always near a river. Every village is near a river. And there's that White Plains path, and that's a dividing line. Okay, now here are some of the trails. And here they're not really named exactly. But the trails also have all been paved, you see. So these are the names they have now. But some of these names of these streets in Westchester are known, and it's a tricky thing. But here, you know, Titicus Road is a good candidate. Walkabuck Road over, let me show you Walkabuck here. Cross River is actually an interpretation of a native word for portage. Old Post Road would be, there actually were Native American male men and women, mostly male men, in the early 1700s. They went to places the white folks just didn't want to go. So there you go. Guard Hill, you know. But anyway, some of these are somewhat native and could be specifically restored. Now, the obvious thing is that, you know, some places have a lot of blue and orange signs, you know, or blue and yellow signs. You know which one I'm talking about, the metal signs? They're historical markers. And I think that's one of the things, one thing that I've been involved in now and then in different states and cities, but that's something that I like to see, is if there was something of historical value at a certain spot that involved Native Americans, I want to see a sign. In Rochester, New York, I started this project of captioning all the river signs in Rochester. There's a lot of them. But to do so, we have to rethink the rivers because the names divide them up in little pieces, and they're originally all just one simple river, you know. So that's something. But again, the metal signs are good. I like the metal signs that show a history because you can acknowledge the Native people that way. You have your hand?
I like that idea a lot, but does that mean like, I don't know if that's likely, but like remapping them, these places, like or at least like Westchester alongside like their English names? Like,
Oh, maps?
yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I showed you some maps where there's English and Wappingers both on the rivers. And this one, fortunately, this map mostly has the English names, but there are some native. So what were you thinking specifically?
Oh, I was just wondering if you were thinking that, because I've seen your maps, I like your maps. But I was just wondering if
finished a Dutchess County map, which has almost every Native American name known in Dutchess County, every geographical name. One of the things that's interesting, I'll just share this with you, it doesn't have anything to do with our topic, but when you're studying these things, you learn a whole lot about the natural world, because all their names are almost all reference the natural world. And one of the principles of native naming is that you never name a beautiful natural feature after yourself, or even your chief or anybody. Like, we don't have like Mount Washington and whatever. It's always, you know, the mountain, the beautiful mountain with the snow on it. So that's almost always true. And the funny thing about the Wappingers, there is a Wappingers Creek in Dutchess County. And the thing is that Wappingers, as you know now, means men of the East. So why would the river be called Men of the East? That doesn't make sense. And they would never say, well, it's the river of the Wappingers, because the river came first. The river is eternal. And I asked a Wappingers friend about this, and they said, yeah, we're just passing through. Why would they name it after us? You know, we're all of us passing through. We're here just for a brief time, and these features will be here for thousands of years. So they wouldn't. Okay? So Wappingers Creek is kind of questionable. They called it Mamanawasik, which means where the beautiful waters gather together. And so keep that in mind, you know. But yeah, all these things are, I think would be very positive steps. Oh, no.
Do you think it would be better than to do something like naming the counties after the different tribes, instead of naming things like the river, like Men of the East, naming like, having like the county, like Wappingers County and stuff like that?
Well, yes and no, because for one thing, the reason the state of Wyoming was named after none of the natives living there was because they didn't want to start, a big competition. So they used a Delaware word from Pennsylvania so nobody would complain. I know it sounds funny, but that worked. And the same thing is if you name the people there, I don't know what the reaction will be. But on the other hand, I kind of like it. But again, it's not really a feature, it's a political thing, right? You can't see Westchester County as a thing. So in a way, I think it probably doesn't break the rule. So I like it too. I like that. It would be very interesting. And there, of course, there are counties. There's a Delaware County, named after the Delaware tribe, and there's a number of them, I think maybe there's a Mohawk County. So that's been done, and I like it, I think. I have to think about it, but I think it's a good idea. So you want to take that initiative and change Westchester to Wequeescik? Why not? Yeah, Wequeescik. That's the hardest word in Algonquin language. But it seems to mean the head of a shallow cove, and prominently. Anyway, it's a hard word to say. But yeah, I like it. So, good questions, anything?
If you were going to suggest a land acknowledgement for Purchase College,
Yeah.
what would you include in that?
Well, I have to go back and look at my map, but yeah. Well, I think it's mostly Siwanoy. So you'd say we are sitting here in the land of the Siwanoy.
Siwanoy, would you include of the Wappingers Confederacy?
Yeah, I would. I think that's sufficient. But again, there was some movement, but also, there was a kind of a puzzle pieces here. But I think Siwanoy is by far the prominent group here. But
The brook on the other side, by the way, that's Blind Brook.
yeah, okay. Yeah. Or do you remember the Algonquin?
The original name of Blind Brook? It was up there.
Right, it was
Yeah.
up there. Okay. I'm just thinking. So here's some, these ones these roads have native names, some of them. And these are names that could be captioned, you see. So when you're tired of the rivers, you can start working on the road. And these are Main Street. And Sigues was a rock, it's still there. Sow is another big rock. And Macassan is another big rock. Oh, this is interesting. This is in Woodpound Ridge, and this is a carving on a rock that looks like a bear's head, and they carved the bear's head on the bear's head. And this is kind of a typical artistic trick the artists would use a lot. But what's interesting, if you look closer, just in case you missed it, that rock looks like a bear's head. They probably helped carve it into that using stone tools, because there's no sharp edges, and then carved in the bear's head. And we don't know any more about it, but here's a very strange thing, is that the bear that it resembles is the brown bear, which hasn't been here for 9,000 years, so how would they know that? Or is it a hoax? Or is it the real thing? Nobody knows. But that's a dead ringer for a brown bear. So I'm going to show you, this will just take a minute, but if you really want to decolonize, you can tear down the buildings and build wigwams. There's a hide rack for drying hides. Mahul. Let me show you, that's a mahul. That's a nice one. Mahul, very much like a Henry Moore sculpture. You know? Mortar and pestle. Wooden dream catchers. Parasite. Shirt. Food area, like we mentioned, at Cross Pond.
Where is this?
Oh, okay, this is what's called a Lenape village in Churchville, Pennsylvania. So this would be more UNAMI territory, but right on the border with Muncie. And just done such a good job that it's actually a border, right on the border between the two, Muncie and UNAMI. But they just did it pretty good job. Here's a longhouse. Inside the longhouse, you see this little bench here to sleep on. And then, oh, you can get 20 people in there easy. Meeting place. So, they definitely had sweat line. They had football. Remember that Jim Thorpe really developed football as we know it, and he had access to the Lenape culture and was the Sac and Fox.
Did they play
Lacrosse.
They invented lacrosse. It was called Baguette, which means the creator's great game. And then it's been called other things by other tribes, so it became known as the little brother of war because it was a good substitute and nobody got killed, you know, unless they stood in the wrong places. So this is Muncie pottery with the castling at the top. You see the castling with these points? And this is UNAMI with no points. So they're different. And then NAMI has some incising on it, where Muncie does too. See, they're very, not that similar. See, in the Muncie has an extra curve, indenture curve there. And then there's the Mohicani tip, which I mentioned. Anybody remember what the word means? You have your hand up.
I was gonna ask a question. I'm not sure what
Go ahead.
that means.
is it River of Mohicans?
No, it does not, because you never name something after
That's
yourself.
right, yeah.
No, it means the greatest of all the arms of the sea that flow both ways. And Mohicans, in a playful way, named themselves after it.
Gotcha.
So what was your other question?
I was gonna ask, do you think for Purchase College, like a good way to help recognize the land that we're on would be to maybe set up, like a display of different, like in the village that we saw in the pictures, like maybe a part of like the art museum, like somewhere on the grounds of the campus? Yeah.
Like a village?
Yeah, like something
Mhm.
like the village and things,
Mhm.
like replicas of different aspects of Wappinger life and stuff like that as a way to like recognize them and like the land that we're on.
Yes, that's just an excellent idea. There's nothing wrong with that. That would probably be very successful, and people would, you know, be impacted by that and give comments, and, you know, it might grow into something, I don't know what. But sure, like you just saw, that was mostly by this one woman who was, you know, is a Lenape, and she pulled all that together. But somebody could do something similar. You could do something similar on their own or through the university.